Hello, everyone. Happy Friday. I wanted to kind of share some thinking I've been doing lately just to see if it can help those of you that are learning Dataverse and maybe, like myself, have a strong background in SharePoint. Sometimes I find that learning new things involves making bridges or connections with the old things that I already know. So I took some time to map out a few of those bridges, kind of like this is to SharePoint, what this is to Dataverse. And it's not intended to compare the products because I don't think these software as a service products are comparable one to one because they are different things. But I do see that there are familiar points of entry or activities that you can see if you look at both of them very closely as to how you do things, or maybe I should say where you do things. So take this as a very low-key kind of ASMR type of video. Sit back and relax and see if you can understand the bridges that I found. And then I'm hoping that some of you who are MVPs or partners, you might take this and kind of, it might spark something in your heads as to how we can help people who are adding Dataverse to their tool belt of services that they use in the cloud. If it helps someone understand Dataverse a little bit better, then I'll consider it a win for this Friday afternoon. So sit back and relax. Consider this kind of like ASMR centric. The first thing I'm going to talk about is administration and features. So both of these cloud services require administration, and both of them have a diverse set of features that can be turned off or on. And kind of the architecture around this is very interesting. So when I think of, and I'll just get my laser pointer here, when I think of sites and hubs, I primarily think of the fact that what is a site or a hub doing in reality? It's a container that is used to tie experiences together, right? It's also a container that's very connected to a region, right? When we create SharePoint sites, we create them in a particular region. And this is very important because the closer our users are to the data, the better the performance will be. Or maybe the opposite is really more true. The further away they are from the data, the more likely there will be latency and performance issues. So SharePoint sites do start with the concept of where, what region, right? But then as we have our SharePoint site, what are we putting into it depends on what the theme of that site is. And that could be a departmental service. It could also be by the type of content or the theme of the content, even the people working together, as we see with SharePoint sites that are created from teams, right? So the team provoked the creation of that site, the group of people working together. But usually you'll find related content of some type directed to people who have relationships as well in a SharePoint site. And nowadays we use hubs more than sites because we have flattened out a bit, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But the equivalent of that, and again, not saying it's the same thing, but for the same outcome, you have the Dataverse environment. So environments are associated with regions as well. Again, for just about the same reason that SharePoint sites are, to facilitate performance, right? So you select your environment, you associate it to a region, you're going to have a good chance of having good performance just from doing that, right? But then after you get into that environment, there might be a certain theme in that environment, or that environment might be owned by a particular environment department, right? So you might create an environment for HR versus finance. You also have environments that are created based on the iterative idea of solution development, which I will talk about. But right now, I just want to point out that environments are similar to SharePoint sites in that they are regional, specific, and because they usually group themes, right? And so we'll talk more about that as we go in there, but that's one connection I kind of see when I look at them both. Then there's site settings. Every site has site settings. Every environment has settings in Dataverse. And so the settings for the environment are found in the Power Apps Admin Center. And let me just let you take a peek at that real quick. So if I thought I had opened up, here we go. So if I go in here and here, just to show you what SharePoint site thing looks like, I'll just go to site contents, and I'm very zoomed in right now, and this is a new site, so you might see some pop-ups bothering us. I'm going to go into settings, site information, and view all site settings, and you can see the kind of things that are in the site settings. And I'm at the site collection level right now, so you have all of that site collection administration that kind of can be inherited throughout this site collection. And when you think about inheritance on the SharePoint side, it has a lot to do with security. But I do notice that Dataverse also has a way to inherit what we call environment variables. And so those variables that are assigned to an environment can be used by all of the solutions in that environment. So I kind of get that similar feel. In Power Apps, you're going to find these settings in the Admin Center. So here I basically, from here, I clicked on this and I went to the Admin Center from the home page. And so I just opened it in advance, and we can look at it again, how I got there. And then here are the environments, but I do my settings by environment, right? So here, if we go into settings, you'll see that I have very similar outline of settings here as well. For instance, if we go to users and permissions, we'll see all of the teams and users in here. Audit, templates, updates, email, integration, data management. So this is all the settings for that environment. So site settings are to Dataverse what the Power Apps Admin Center are to SharePoint, sorry, what the Power Apps Admin Center is to Dataverse. And site features are also a subset of site settings. Site features are to SharePoint what the product features are in Dataverse. And I think we did spot that here. Product features. And you can see there's a long list of features in here that you'll decide whether you want to enable them or not. There's common ones that I tend to enable, like embedded content, to give me the maps in my model-driven apps, to give me my really instant Power BI visualizations based on views. But you have a lot of stuff in here. Those of you that are using PCF controls for Canvas apps have to remember to come in here and enable that so that it works. So it's just, again, it's just a familiar thing, right? Then I talk about SharePoint subsites. Now, subsites, we've kind of stopped. I mean, many people still use subsites, but for the most part, we've flattened out to hubs. And there's lots of reasons why we flattened out to hubs. It's a good decision to make. But what they provided for us historically is like that subset of experiences under a major theme. So under the site, you might have hierarchy subsites, but it would be like they'd be related to the parent site, and therefore those subsites would inherit properties from the parent site, right? And it was kind of our way of extending value, you know, from the top level all the way to a lower level. Again, we do hubs more often now. We're flattened out. But when I think about subsites and I think about Dataverse, I think not about a sub environment, but I think about solutions, right? Solutions in my mind, they do a lot of this stuff that we did in many different features in one place. So a subsite is a maybe a smaller version of a parent, right? So maybe I'll make a solution and I want to distribute it to multiple environments as one of the many solutions in the environment, right? And instead of using a sub environment, I actually can just publish solutions out. So I can create one solution package, and we'll talk about in the future, we'll talk about all that can contain, but I'll show you today a little bit of that. And then we can publish that all over our tenant, right? Not just in that environment. And I can use a solution in order to create sub solutions in my environment. But to me, solutions combine the whole idea of site templates, list templates, JavaScript components, and web parts into a single service for application lifecycle management. And I don't know how many of you probably remember creating site templates, but you would create your site template, and then you could use that template in another place in your tenant, or you could even take it outside the tenant and kind of copy that site design. And this is kind of very old school, because then we've actually progressed in SharePoint beyond the idea of site templates. But we still need list templates sometimes, right? We want to take that list and we want to reuse it in another place. SharePoint has done a great job of simplifying list templates. And I'll tell you what, when we get to the topic of list, we'll talk about list templates, because I just want to, at this point, say that to me, solutions roll up all that stuff together. So anytime you want to replicate something or carry over properties from something you've done before, solutions are a great way to do that. And very often we'll leverage environment properties or variables in order to work between those solutions. So this is kind of like administration and features. I think the big difference with the Dataverse world is that the Power Apps Admin Center is the one place you go to manage all your environment settings, whereas in SharePoint, it's basically site by site, unless you're a global admin and you have access to the administration center for the tenant, which is extremely rare. So in real life, you're basically managing administration from your site, but in Power Apps and Dataverse, you're managing all of your site settings from one single admin center. And you probably have noticed the admin center just keeps getting better and better, because it's a lot of things that you can manage there as your environment admin, right? Okay, so then I want to talk about content management. And I put it in quotations. You probably can guess why, right? Dataverse is not a content management tool, right? So, but it still is capable of doing content management type things, right? So what are some examples of content management as what we kind of think of that in SharePoint land? We think about pages very often first, right? Because when you open a SharePoint site, you don't land in a list, or you land on a page. And that page is primarily, when it comes to SharePoint, intended for internal use, right? And then I think, I don't know, a few years back, we got the ability to easily add external guests. So we would allow or not allow external guests to be in our SharePoint sites, which enabled external people to see the pages. But again, the intent was this was an internal tool, and then we opened it up to external guests through the Azure Active Directory and so forth and so on, that enabled us to have this conditional access. do you have pages in Dataverse? You do. And many of you know what a custom page is, right? And you can use that inside of a model-driven app. But I think even closer to a SharePoint page would be more like the Power Pages. Although I will say that the biggest difference to me between SharePoint page and Power Pages is that Power Pages has the intent of being able to allow that anonymous user, like right off the bat. I think all of us who have worked in SharePoint for years understand what it takes to have anonymous access to a SharePoint page. You're going to have half that effort with Power Pages because that's its goal. Its goal is to enable you to create a website. People, whoever they are, can see what's on the page, or you can configure what people see based on how you want them to access that data from your website. And so I think the difference between these two, even though they're related, is that the SharePoint page is leaning towards internal, and the Power Pages page is leaning towards external. And you'll see that in the ease of use if you try to do the opposite thing, which can be done. But if you try to do the opposite thing, you will see it gets a little bit more complex for you. But custom pages can also be considered pages, although they're usually found in an application, whereas SharePoint pages are not in an application. Okay, so list, and this is the one that people seem to think they think of this right away. Oh, a list is a table. And you do know that we've gone through some changes as to what we call a Dataverse table. But one of the key reasons why it's challenging to understand the difference between a table and an entity and why we're calling them tables and so forth is because, in fact, a list is not the same thing as a Dataverse table, although it mimics the feel of it. So if you think of a list as columns and rows, right, then yeah, it's the same thing. Tables have columns and rows, and the list in SharePoint have columns and rows. But in essence, a list in SharePoint, which, by the way, I don't know if you all know this, but every single thing in SharePoint is a list. So it's just if you were to break down SharePoint's architecture, all you would find is lists, because that's at the core of it, with the back end being SQL, right? But it's not just one SQL table. It's this is a consolidation of lists, a lot of them, and they're closer to what you might think of as a list management tool, such as Excel, right? Where you're managing lists and you're managing stuff inside lists. And so lists are very friendly like Excel as well. You can easily add a column. You can easily edit it as an Excel worksheet. And we'll talk about how I'll show you how that's done in Dataverse. But basically, there's only one type of relationship you can create. It's called a lookup column. Lookup columns are composite in nature on SharePoint. So whereas I might be able to have a invoice table that's looking up to a customer, I might have a list for invoices that's looking up to a customer list to identify the customer. That lookup column is creating a one-to-many relationship, but it's not the same way a database would actually create those relationships. And as you start to look at Dataverse tables, and we'll talk about CTM as well, you'll notice that there is a strong infrastructure around relationships, database relationships. These relationships become very, very handy, especially when you start using their natural features, which is how they can easily help you show related items on a solution page, on an app page. If you delete one thing, you can cascade that deletion down, right? You have these referential situations in a database that's relational, that you won't actually see in SharePoint. Definitely not in the same way. So there is a similarity between a list and a table because they both have columns and rows, but a table in Dataverse is a little bit more. And I'm just going to give you a little peek at what I mean by that. So here are my list of tables in Dataverse, and I'm just going to open up the account table and kind of zoom out a little bit just so you can see it all. You notice when I land on this table, you'll see kind of something similar to what you saw in SharePoint. Here are my columns and my rows, and if I hit a plus sign, I can add a new column, and if I hit this, I can add something else down here. And I can edit right here, kind of like the SharePoint. Okay. So I have edit in tables. So just like I have in SharePoint, all right? But if you look at the top of this screen, and I'm just going to scroll up here, you're going to see a lot of other things that are built in, such as forms and views, which everybody will say to me, Audrey, we have forms and views in SharePoint too. Of course you do. It's a very typical thing in this case. But I will say that when I click on views and forms in Dataverse, you're going to have a lot more out of the box, which you may choose to revise. For instance, if I wanted a view of just the active accounts from a particular city, then I can edit the view that's built in and just do a save as, right? So let's see what's editable here. Okay, looks like we have a couple customers in Redmond. So I can save this as active Redmond accounts. Save. So now I've cloned what Dataverse gave me out of the box, just because usually Dataverse makes good choices on what should be in this view, right? And it's very easy for me to revise the view if I want to add additional columns and such. So, and what I need to do is filter. So my sorting and my filtering is down here. And so I can add a new column. And I think that was address city equals Redmond. Okay. And now as I revise my view, it shows me a preview of what that would look like. And if I decide I want the account number in this view, I can just drag and drop it in there, and now I have the account number, which doesn't seem to be populated, but if it was, you would see the data there. So I love the drag and drop, both for adding and putting things back. So let's see if we can find something that might be. And I can search here for columns. I kind of like that. I remember how I would get confused on what line I was on when I was editing views. In this case, it's a very unified feel to how this works, and so you can just drag and drop, and then you can validate that what you did is working because it gives you a preview right there. All right, so then when I save this, though, I'm saving a new view called Active Redmond. So I think the point I want to make here is that although both have forms and views, Dataverse, because of the CDM, which I will talk about in a few minutes, because of the common data model, has a lot of views and forms already there for you with like the best practices in forms and views. And so I really like that. And I do use forms and views a little bit more than I did on SharePoint because I can use them in my solutions, right? And the solution will keep the view exactly the way I configured it. All right, so we saved and published. You will notice also in Dataverse that the combination of save and publish will be very obvious because the point is I want to be able to control when this is published to my active users, right? So you'll see that happen. There's a pretty strong focus on modern solution management in Dataverse. All right, then we have these groups. SharePoint group is a place where you kind of group together users. I think those of us that have actually worked with SharePoint security extensively have a habit of using Azure Active Directory security groups as the users that populate those groups. It just makes it much easier to manage from your identity management tool. The same way we group people, and we use that grouping in SharePoint. And let's see if I can, do I have a SharePoint site I can quickly, yeah, let me show you here. If I do share here, you'll see these groups: site owners, site members, and site visitors. And basically the group is on the left side of the little dash, and the permission settings, plural, is on the right. Because what happens on SharePoint is they're simplifying this. They're abstracting from the end user the whole idea of permissions levels. But they are still there. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But this is how you decide who's going to do what. Basically, you put them in one of these three groups, and you can create your own group. And I can put an Active Directory, Azure Active Directory security group right in these as well, which people who want to protect data even from the site admins will often do. Okay, so that's groups in SharePoint, and SharePoint groups are to SharePoint kind of what business units, teams, and security roles are doing together in Dataverse, right? So a group is a container in SharePoint, just like a security role is a container in Dataverse. And that security role decides what people have access to, what they own, and what they can do with what they have, as well as the groups of business units and teams. So the biggest difference when it comes to these two here is that Dataverse is role-based security. It's designed to reflect how the teams, the business units work, right? And then the security roles, which we'll talk about in a minute, contain permission, security privileges, just like groups contain permission levels, okay? It is kind of similar. Groups are to SharePoint, what security roles are to Dataverse, and permission levels in SharePoint are what security privileges are to Dataverse. And second, I'm going to go to site contents, and then here from site contents, I'm going to go to site settings. And then in here, I'm going to, so the closest word to permissions in Dataverse is privilege. So they are just about the same thing. But it looks like here that the permission level is edit. But notice permission levels is plural, right? That's not a singular thing. That's a plural thing. And if you click on permission levels here in SharePoint, you can view the ones that are out of box, right? And they define them, right? But if you wanted to add your own permission level, you could. Let's add a permission level, just see, so we can see. Okay, so you can add your own permission level. So those that were there fall into those default buckets. But look at all the different permission levels you get. List permissions, whether you can manage a list or just edit a list or delete things and add things. Site permissions, whether you can do style sheets, whether you can do blah, blah, blah. Whether you can open and close things. And then personal permissions is about your personal views and whether or not you can have your own personal web parts and so forth. So this is the complex sauce that's kind of stuffed into these default groups and kind of abstracts that complexity from people. But again, people who have been working with SharePoint for a year have created their own permission levels and have very often provided Azure Active Directory groups to these groups in order to do that. Now, on the same line of thought, if we go into Power Apps and we go into the Admin Center, which I might have open, let's see, yes, I do. So I'm going to go back here. This was the features we were looking at. I'm going to go back to the settings for this environment, and I'm going to go into users and permissions, and we're going to look at security roles, because remember I said groups are to SharePoint, what roles are to Dataverse. Beautiful thing is, though, that security is very granular in Dataverse. It's not quite as simple in its capabilities as SharePoint, right? So if I edit one of these, and look how many there are. So it's not 3. There's a whole bunch, right? And they all mean different things. But I would look into them and learn more about them, because so to me, relations, the power of the database relationships are the number one plus for when I will choose Dataverse, when I need to manage relationships between tables more than lookup columns. The other thing is when I need granular, and I mean that very sincerely, very granular security. So you saw how many more security roles you had, right? Now you'll see how many more privileges you have. And notice as I go through these tabs, and I'll zoom in a little bit, see if you can see them better. There are tabs controlling the privileges for the core records, but you can go further. There's a tab that kind of gives privileges for customization, right? And if we scroll over even more, we have privileges for business process flows. We have privileges for custom entities. So basically, it's not just record privileges from the way we look at it in SharePoint. It's the privileges on any type of record in Dataverse, and everything in here has a table associated with it, and that's why we can set those privileges against those things, because they show up in tables. This is one thing I truly appreciate. For the most part, you've got the same CRUD operations that you have in most cloud services, but you'll see append and append to, and that is purely because of the relationships, right? The relationships, you need to have privileges to update those relationships. It depends on which direction you're going as to whether that's append or append to. Then you have the idea of record ownership. So again, role-based security is going to always involve record ownership. So you can assign records to people, and you can share records. When you share, you keep the ownership, but you also share it. So very cool how much value you have in the combination of these two things in Dataverse. It's like security on steroids, and I know some people don't like when I say that, but it's wonderful. It's the bomb, right? Lots of options you don't have up here. Doesn't mean that up here isn't valuable, and there aren't solutions that I would choose to build on SharePoint. But if I needed that extension, if I needed more security, I would definitely head towards Dataverse. Now, one thing I cannot one-to-one here is in security in Dataverse, you have what's called column level security. Some people call it field level security, right? FLS. You won't have that in the SharePoint world, but you will find it under security in Dataverse, only it's called, and this is where people don't notice this, but when you're in the admin center, let's see if I can go back here. Okay, you're in the admin center, you're in settings. If you look under users, because all the security stuff is under users and permissions, you'll see column security profiles. So column security profiles are handled a little bit different than security roles, but they enable you to allow people to read, edit, delete values inside columns that are protected. Okay, so let's suppose you had a table of employees and you didn't want people to see the column for like their initials, their offer value, right? So what their initial salary offer was is in a column in that employee table. We don't want anybody to see that, but maybe certain people in HR, right? And so we can set a security profile on that. And to me, whenever you need column level security, I think the first thing I do think about is Dataverse. And it's not hard. It's super easy because I'll just show you. I'll just go here and I'll just go to that. We were looking at account revenue column. So let me go back to here and go to the columns for the account. And you'll notice that there's one called annual revenue. So let's suppose the annual revenue, I don't want everybody to see that, right? Because that's confidential, right? Let's imagine, right? So in that case, what I can do in the advanced options of this column is just turn on column level security. And I guess I've already done that, right? So basically, when you build your columns, you can decide to turn on column level security. But here's the catch. When you save this change, so you check column level security and then you press save. I had already done it, so I don't have to press save. That column is now hidden to from everybody but you, because nobody else can see it. You just hit it, right? And usually you're the admin that's doing that. So you'd have to remember to go into your security profiles, find that column, and set up the permissions, right? Whenever you create a new security profile, you're going to see all the columns in this environment, and I'll just zoom out again. All the columns in this environment that have been marked enable column security. And then you will be able to, based on teams and users, assign rights to read, update, and create, okay? You can leave them all not allowed, but then nobody will see anything. They'll see a little asterisk if that column shows up in a view, but they won't see the data. So if you want to let people see it or update it or read it, you'll have to come here and create a security policy. But that's one of the big pluses, I think, when I think of Dataverse security. Another thing that I want to talk to you about briefly before I end this video is scalable components. And what are scalable components? They're things that you don't want to just use once. You're going to want to use them more than once. And that's what enables us to scale, right? So I want to talk about 4 scalable components here. There are more. I didn't talk about content types here. I hope to talk about that soon. I'm still thinking through that. And I'm not talking about records management here. I'm still thinking through that. So we'll talk about that later. But enterprise terms is the first tool of scale, I think, that people think about on an enterprise level. How do they make their metadata consistent, right? So that I'm not tagging Microsoft and then my partner is tagging MS and somebody else is tagging micro, right? And then when we go look for all the things related to Microsoft, we don't get micro, we don't get MS, because there are variants that we wouldn't naturally filter for. So we use enterprise terms to standardize the metadata on our company. And what's interesting about SharePoint enterprise terms is they have 2 faces. They have initially the face that is cross-tenant, and we call it like above the line. And then they have the site collection terms that are specific to that site collection, and that those are the below the line terms. But in both cases, the goal is to scale the terms to the scope that we needed. One thing I noticed in Dataverse that we have that's not exactly the same, but it does give you that same type of outcome, is if you use global choices. So as you know, you can create choice lists in Dataverse, but it comes with a set of global choices, which means that those choices will be available. Well, because they're built into the product, they'll be available in every single environment that you make. But you can create your own choice lists and reuse that across your tenant. So basically, when you're in Dataverse, choices, all right? So the choices are reusable, right? So you can use these choices in your tables, you can use these choices in your forms, they're just all reusable. But you can create your own, right? And then when you create a new choice, right, maybe, and I do suggest you use choices for under a dozen items, right? Because choice lists are, usually used in a drop down of some type, and you don't want to have them fishing through 100 choices, right? So you have your, I'm not going to type them all, but as you type them, they are given a unique identifier, which kind of just leave it there, but you can change it, right? And then basically this choice you can now use in this environment, right? This new department's choice that I just made, and I already have one. So I'll just put department choices because I did the same thing twice. Shame on me. And this will save. Now, how do I scale this to more than one environment? Do you remember what I said was kind of like the key to scale in Dataverse? The key to scale is solutions. So I would create a solution. Let's pick a solution I've already created. Well, let's just create a solution so you can see how easy it is to create a solution. We'll just call it new solution. It has a publisher, which will be a prefix that you will see on your custom tables and columns. And then you'll just hit create. And then so now I have a solution and I'm inside this solution. Now I will use this solution to publish anything in it, whether that be pages or dashboards or tables or bots or whatever else I might want to reuse elsewhere, right? I will put it inside the solution. So what I'm going to add is an existing choice, and then I will choose that department choices choice list. And now this department choices choice list can start traveling around to my other environments. So like I said, when I think of elsewhere, but when I think of templates, anytime I want to replicate something that I did before, I use solutions, as well as when I want to do an official application lifecycle management, where I want to take my solution from a dev environment, push it into a test environment, and then finally it'll get approval to go into prod. Solutions are the way that your work will travel in those different environments. And you use enterprise variables, very similar to how you have site settings in SharePoint, right? Although it's very ALM centric, which is a wonderful thing. I don't know how many of you remember how much time we spent on writing PowerShell scripts. I think I knew the commandlets for SharePoint only. So somebody said, do you know PowerShell? I know SharePoint commandlets, because we had to do it so much, right? And so again, site and list templates, they all happen in that solution. But I also think of the CDM as a kind of a template, because like I said, when you get your Dataverse, your Dataverse database gets installed, you get a ton of CDM tables. Common data model, that stands for, and if you do aka.ms/CDM, then you'll get the whole story about what I mean when I say CDM. But it's not just tables, it's also the relationships between those tables. And those relationships plus the tables is what makes these like out of the box, what we call model driven apps. Because if the model is good, then the app will be good. So when you create your own custom tables and columns, then you have to be the one to configure the relationships that are necessary based on your requirements. And I think for a lot of people, those relationships can be challenging if they've never had like the job of understanding what a database schema is. That can be challenging. But the product is working very hard to kind of abstract that away from those of you so that you don't need to learn all that Dataverse schema stuff. All right, so CDM is another bunch of list templates in the sense that they are tables that are given to you that you can reuse. And the good thing is you don't just have to get them blank like you do when you get a SharePoint list template. The data you see on the screen when you're looking at list templates is just used to check what you're going to get. but you don't get the data. You just get the raw table. If you wanted some sample data in these default tables, all you have to do is go to your admin center settings, and then under data management, you can see that you can add sample data, which means that you can populate your CDM tables with sample data. It's a good way to learn how they work and kind of see how those relationships pan out in the scope of a solution. All right, so what else do we talk about? Web parts. Now, I'm from old school SharePoint, where we used to download the web part, revise it, and then upload a new one, and this was kind of like a mini solution. So I could say that solutions also solve the web part question. But I think the closest thing to web parts, which are mini widgets that you see on SharePoint pages, right? And those widgets can be talking to lists, they can be talking to libraries, they can even be doing summary calculations and things like that. Those web parts probably are closer in Dataverse to PCF controls. So think of PCS, the Power Apps Component Framework, right? This is a way of building many different types of widgets that fit into your solutions. So you can create a PCF control that represents a customer form, and you can use that customer form in 15, 20, 1,000 applications, that same form. Maybe it has a logo in the top corner or something. So you can keep reusing it for consistency across your tenant, right? PCF controls are installed into the environment, but again, you can use solutions to carry them around your entire tenant and even outside of your tenant. If you are a developer that's looking for a way to monetize widgets, PCF controls is the money maker there. Because most of the time, web parts like PCF controls tend to lean towards the developer audience, because this is like Fusion. What happens is the developers get to build these really sophisticated components, and then the people who don't want to learn how to code can just leverage them, right? Just use these repositories of controls. Although I will say I have been able to make my own web parts, as I have been able to make my own PCF control in the past, even though I am not a developer and I would not want to get into writing code all day. I could figure out how to do it. So it's possible for anyone to create a control. It's possible for anyone to create a web part. But they do lean towards the developer audience in both cases, where you want those very elegant, very sophisticated components that you'll reuse all over your company. The most unique thing, I think, in SharePoint is document libraries. And hands down, I will say nobody beats SharePoint at document management. I don't think anyone has the capacity to have the investment of time that SharePoint has had when it comes to management of documents, right? It's just awesome. It's got an awesome integration with Microsoft Office. We can create those quick parts. We can build documents from columns in SharePoint, and we can generate templates and so forth. Even every list has the ability to add your own document templates to it. There's OpenXML. There's quite a bit of time investment into SharePoint documents. And so I don't think there's anywhere that you can find that will manage documents as well as SharePoint does, from ideation, from that draft, all the way through destruction at the end of a records management or a file retention plan. SharePoint does really well with in-place records and so forth. So the question is, how do documents show up in Dataverse? They show up in 3 different ways. I have 2 on this slide. One way is through attachments. So basically, when you create a table and you enable attachments, then you have this relationship to the attachments from that table that enable you to add files and notes, okay? In addition to that, you have something very unique that SharePoint users are are unfamiliar with for the most part, and that's column types that are files, which is very unique, and it's got its advantages. And I would say that there are times when I'll choose a file column type, especially when it's a one-to-one relationship. For instance, I want every candidate to have a resume, or I want every customer to have a contract. And I might have a situation where I have two file columns in my list where I want maybe I'm in entertainment and everybody has to have a picture and they have to have a CV, and then they're going to have a contract. So I might end up with 3 different file columns in that record for that person who's auditioning for a role, right? So there are definitely times for this. And then there's a third way, and that is Dataverse does actually support the integration of SharePoint document libraries within its model-driven app, so that you can actually see related documents in SharePoint, create related documents in SharePoint directly from the model-driven app. That is a third way. So you could take it, you could kind of have the best of both worlds, although there are some limitations when it comes to how many files can be managed in a particular solution, and or whether or not you'll get the same level of security. So anytime, I would suggest anytime you plan to integrate document libraries, I would set AAD security groups on the SharePoint that it results from that. That SharePoint site should have AAD security controls. Otherwise, you could be putting yourself in an uncomfortable situation. So that integration is not one-to-one. It's an integration service in the product. But again, it's not a perfect integration, I'll put it that way. But it's a great integration if you just want to add some resumes to your you want a repository of resumes that you would reach out to when you need a new somebody in your company. Those resumes are only for HR. The SharePoint site would be permissioned to the AAD security group representing HR. Then you could turn on the integration in Dataverse to that site. So you'd specify that site that has that security group privilege, and then you can use this without any problem. Again, another big difference is document libraries. If you integrate with Dataverse, the content in the document libraries does not impact your capacity in Dataverse. However, when you use attachments and file column types, the capacity is going to be impacted by how many files and attachments you have. And I just want to take you there and kind of show you what this looks like. So if I back to assuming that this account represents all the people who are auditioning for the next play. So let's say I'm in entertainment and I'm using Dataverse to manage my auditions, right? So in this case, I'm using an account to represent the people auditioning, right? I can use the account as their company, their agency, and then maybe have them as a contact, or I can have them be the account, right? But let's say I want to include a contract with this account, right? Or a picture, right? Or maybe their picture and maybe their curriculum vitae, right? So, right? Well, let's do the photo. Let's do the photo first, all right? So we do photo, and if you look down here, you see that there's the file type. And I basically have 2 choices, image or file. So you might say an image is a file, Audrey. Yeah, but the way you choose this is if you want to see the picture on one of your forms in Dataverse, then choose image, because then it will actually display the picture on the screen. And there are certain file formats that are respected for that. Common ones are PNG and JPEG, right? But if I don't necessarily want to see the photo, then I can always choose file. So there's you really can always choose file unless you want to see the picture, right? So in this case, I might choose image and then save. And then since I didn't put a contract in here, let's go ahead and create a regular file so I can show you the difference in how these look. Okay, so just give that a minute to save. Okay, so now that is saved, and now I'm going to add one more column for contract, and I'm also going to choose the file type and file. Okay, and now I'm going to save. Now while that's saving, I'll point out that other thing I mentioned to you. So I mentioned to you that when you create a table, you can also decide you can have attachments to it. So basically, when I create a brand new table is where I can say I want it to have attachments and notes, and then they will be associated to the related tables for notes and files. And I suppose I can show you what that looks like as well, but let's see if that finished. Okay, so I think we have contract. There we go, we have contract, and it's a file type. And then we have photo. You always have to have a photo. And that is an image type. That's how Dataverse handles files. And again, you can integrate with document libraries. So I guess the last couple things I want to say is this idea of content management. Dataverse is not content management. SharePoint is, right? But you get extra stuff on top of the list in Dataverse. And just to show you a couple more things in addition to what I've already showed you as far as extras go on the table, in addition to forms and views, and you get a lot of them that you can clone and revise. You also have the relationships that are built into the CDM, alternate keys that can be used for importing data, views, forms, but also charts, dashboards, business rules, commands. So I can associate a business rule to this table. So I'm going to go back to my accounts table, and I'm going to imagine that my finance team needs me to make sure that there is a geographical code, right? For every account, there's a code for the country that code is with, because how they handle the accounts payable, accounts receivable might be different, right? So I could teach everybody in my company what the codes are for their country, but rather than doing that, I can set a business rule that says if the state, so let's go by country actually. If the country or the region is United States, so, well, there is a United States under here. Let's hide this one and see if that helps us see the country. Hide. I have the challenge of keeping it big enough for you. Okay, so here's the country. Every time somebody puts in a new account in the US, I can set a business rule that says, okay, if it's US, set the company code or the country code to 1010, right? And so this is the beautiful thing about business rules is they happen in the back end. You don't have to teach people how to do stuff. You can just do it for them based on some condition in the application. In this case, the condition was what country you're in, right? And so the business rules knows what all the company codes are and therefore can set them as soon as the person chooses a state. But think of all the many different ways you can use business rules to put a logic into your data. So what's the advantage of putting logic into your data? Something that we don't normally do in SharePoint, but when you put logic into the data, into the list itself, that means that every person who builds an app against this table will also be forced to respect that business rule, right? And you don't have to count on them to remember to configure that rule in their Canvas app expressions because it's already in the data. And so therefore it's going to happen whether you're in a Canvas app or a model-driven app whether you build one app or 1,000, right? Really, really love that. And then there's so much more I could tell you about why tables are different than lists. At the core, they both have columns and rows. But what you have built into Dataverse in your table is additional value for scaling out a data model, right? A data model that can be reused across solutions. And that table also includes the capacity needed for those file columns that we talked about. So this is like my little preliminary meditations on these two services. Again, not comparing them or saying that I'm not making a comparison between these two things, because I really don't think that they're equal. So that you can't, like, they're not apples to apples. So, but looking at these connections and these bridges kind of helps me to understand how, where to go in Dataverse for what I want to do. And then I have an expectation that the things that I typically do in SharePoint will be available in Dataverse, and very often much, much more. So having both of them in my tool belt extends the type of solutions and scenarios I can support from the customers that I work with. So I hope this was helpful to you, that you understand my meditations. Love to hear your comments in the chat as to whether you agree with this is to SharePoint, what this is to Dataverse. And again, the goal of this is just to help people understand Dataverse. It's a very deep animal, and so getting to see how it compares to other things is very helpful. All right, I wish you the best weekend, and I hope you will also take some time to explore Dataverse and find out what it can do for you.